Welcome to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. And now here's your host, Wade T. Lightheart.
What if you could double your energy naturally without caffeine or stimulants in just 3 short months? It's not only possible, you can transform every aspect of your health if you follow the 12-week blueprint we've created for you in the Awesome Health System. The Awesome Health System is a free course where you receive a daily video lesson spanning the most cutting-edge secrets for air, water, exercise, sunshine, optimizers, mindset, and education. It's something most companies would charge hundreds of dollars for, yet you get it for free when you go to bioptimizers.com. To access your course, register to download the PDF report called 3 Phases of Bioptimization, which gets you access to the report and daily access to the first lesson in the 12-week, 84-day Awesome Health course.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. It's Wade T. Lightheart from Bioptimizers with another edition of the Awesome Health Podcast. And boy, oh boy, am I excited today because we have a very special guest, Dr. Aneel Paulus, an MD/MS, and he is a distinguished physician, scientist, and consultant with over 15 years experience in translational oncology, clinical trials, and drug development from preclinical to early stage clinical phases. He's worked at the Mayo Clinic. He was focused on mature B cell cancers. Of course, cancer is a big issue in my life. Of course, I was impacted with my sister's death early in life. And of course, I'm always interested in what's going on in that area. And it's much more complicated than people might see on the surface. Cancer carries a wide umbrella, and you really need expertise in that area. And what's really interesting is he's not limited to just pharmaceutical integrations. He started looking at the properties of the neem plant used in Ayurvedic medicine for many years. Of course, I think one of the most famous advocates of that was Mahatma Gandhi. And of course, curcumin, which is probably the most studied nutritional supplement in the world. And of course, what's also interesting about Dr. Paulus is that his range of capability deals with aging, immunology, cancer, neuroscience, neuromodulation, and psychedelic-assisted therapies, all things that we are extremely interested in. I won't read you his entire bio because it's so long and so impressive. We'd take up the whole podcast to do that, but that's a little insight. So let's welcome Dr. Aneel to the podcast. Hey, thanks for joining us.
Wade, thank you so much for having me, and you are too kind. What an intro! I didn't even know those things myself. Hey, glad.
Yeah, sometimes that's so common with high performers. They forget all the things that they're doing and think it's kind of okay. And then other people are like, is this person actually a human? Is like how do they possibly do all of these various areas? But that's what we're here to do. We're here to bring the latest, the greatest, and the most cutting edge individuals to kind of help us navigate the complications of information. We're in information overload, and the reality is most of us don't have the capacity to discern truth from falsehood, real research versus, overpumped marketing hype, and as well as the variability is you might have particular research information that is positive, and then some companies taking that and borrowing on that research, but they're candy coating the products and services that they might be offering that actually don't produce the results that the original research did. And it's a very big issue. However, we do feel that right now a new paradigm of health is opening, largely in part because a lot of the authorities and regulatory bodies, as well as the lobbyist groups, have now been exposed over the last 4 years of maybe not taking the possibilities of human potential for both quality of life and quantity of life. And ideally, you want to synchronize both of those things. And you're really on the forefront of those elements. How did you get, how does a guy go from oncology into psychedelics and AI and all of this? I'm curious, just your background and how did you navigate that very unusual trajectory? Usually one person's in one camp or the other, and then how AI comes in there. God only knows how that comes. So can you share with the listeners maybe a little bit about your journey before we dive into some interesting topics?
Sure. So to me, they're all interconnected, and the link is really this. So my background, as you mentioned, is in oncology, and at some point, maybe about 8, 9 years ago, I was introduced to AI and machine learning in the process of drug development. For those who may not know, drug development traditionally has been an extremely time and cost intensive and highly inefficient process. 90% of drugs fail. The cost to bring a drug to market is anywhere between $1 to $2 billion, and takes 10 years. And this is in the oncology sector mostly. So clearly, we're not doing something right. And when I was introduced to the prospects of really digitizing biological data and then being able to simulate and screen different drugs, understanding the salient properties of, let's say, a cell, its genomics, its metabolomics, transcriptome, and then punting different molecules all in silico, that to me was a game changer. And I felt like, okay, this is the future, it's coming. And so I was exposed to AI and machine learning technologies, in the last decade, from the aspect of drug development in oncology. Now, fast forward many years, and as I've had the good fortune of developing certain molecules that have made it into the clinic, coming up with novel combinations at my lab in the Mayo Clinic. And one of the things that kept pricking me and keeping me up at night, Wade, was that, okay, I've got this traditional pathway, with pharma collaborations that I had with some big names. I'm not going to take their names, but helping them develop drugs, coming up with some own molecules that I discovered and patented. And in parallel, I was seeing some remarkable results. And I'll just touch on this briefly before we come back to it in an arc. Natural medicines, natural sources like neem, curcumin. And it was incredible to actually see that these were medicines, these were plant-derived, naturally derived molecules that were able to actually kill off cancer cells with tumor-specific specificity, meaning they wouldn't touch the healthy cells unless you went really high doses. So, I started realizing and thinking, like, wait a second, maybe the path that I'm developing some of these things on is not the only answer. Maybe there is wisdom and there's a lot of science that still needs to be figured out for these naturally derived medicines. So that was one particular aspect of the journey. And as I moved forward in this journey, I kept thinking to myself that, okay, everybody's developing cancer. The statistics are 1 in 2 people in this country will be touched in some way, shape, or form by cancer, whether themselves or a loved one. And the more and more that I started looking at, okay, what's common, what's happening, I realized that there's this one particular variable that's in every clinical trial, that's in every study that I ever look at, as part of a a table that's provided as to, hey, what are the risk factors here that led, that were common amongst group 1, group 2 in a trial, and unilaterally, like across the board, barring one exception, is that age. The aging process is the single greatest risk factor for development of cancer, really. And the longer you live, the greater your chances are for developing any number of cancers. Now, barring that one possibility or that exception, that's pediatric or childhood cancers. There's a slightly different etiology for those. So it really made me realize, and just it happened, this synchronicity where I met a particular researcher in Italy at a conference. So we were both speaking on the same protein. He's looking at it from the lens of aging, and I'm looking at it from the lens of cancer. And we both converged, and it was just this beautiful enmeshment of our worlds where I realized, like, okay, wait a second. If I'm going to take on cancer and I want cure, I'm going after cures now. A word that I have been hesitant to use and many physicians are hesitant to use, it's just, you shudder from that. Then it can't just be by putting a Band-Aid on a patient, by giving them the best thing that company XYZ came out with today and advertised. That's not a cure. That's like, once it's taken root, now it's a Band-Aid that we're going to put on you and just manage you. So in all of this kind of like this transition as I was having, in my own career, looking at cancer, trying to tackle it, trying to kill it, always a step behind, I realized that, wait a second, the best cure is going to be prevention. If we can slow down that aging process, if we can start thinking about these alternative plant-derived medicines maybe, and figuring out, okay, can you develop drugs out of them, or can you actually start taking them in certain concoctions and combinations that basically slow down the aging process, lead to an anti-inflammatory kind of milieu in the body. Psychedelics, so to say, came right at the tail end of that, when I was able to appreciate the connection between the mind and the body, and really this connection between the brain, the neuroelectrical, neurochemical, neurohormonal circuits that feed into the body and either drive the cancer or protect you against it, because they're feeding into the immune system and allowing for the immune system to keep that cancer at bay. So for me, cancer is this one kind of central lens that I view these other disciplines through. That, okay, if we're all at this risk for developing cancer, what can we do to prevent that? And what I've realized, the keys that I've been kind of exploring and realize is, you've got to start thinking about preventing or slowing the aging process. And in that whole strategy, mind, body, soul all comes into play. And that's really where that unification for me between longevity medicine, AI, and psychedelics is kind of all intertwined. I hope that
really.
it's
funny. You and I have actually come to the similar conclusions through completely different routes, because early on when I got exposed to cancer with my sister, who died at 22, I was like, wait a second, my life isn't a guarantee and my health isn't a guarantee. And that started on an external knowledge seeking ask, well, maybe if I look strong or have muscles or these type of things. And then years later, I ran into Dr. Michael O'Brien, who looked like it was at a central casting for Cocoon, the movie that had all these like aging people who are living this extraordinary life. And he had a massive influence, which was the foundation of Bioptimizers getting into gut health, particularly with enzymes and probiotics and proteolytic probiotics that had a variety of capabilities. And then we applied that into sports performance. And then eventually that moved. I was running a little holistic health clinic, and we saw that there was correlations in managing blood sugar and managing physical response, blood sugar being a contributor of cancer, also a contributor of heart disease. And so if you look at the big three, or the big four killers, we've got, heart disease, cancer, diabetes, and medical error. And medical error is usually involved in treating the first three things, which were all of those preemptively. Now, I don't have any expertise as a medical doctor or as a practitioner, anyone at that capabilities, but I was an expert in human performance. I was like, oh, okay. Well, if I switch human performance from, say, an athletic model into what we call as a physically optimized model, then we should be able to increase the likelihood of extending a healthy quality of life. Of course, I had the good fortune of living on a street with three centenarians, one who's still alive today. She's 106 years old. And I realized it wasn't all neurochemistry. It wasn't all diet. It wasn't all supplementation. She doesn't take any supplements. She doesn't do any particular different elements to dietary stuff. Neither did the other two centenarians. But they did have an aspect of social connection, purpose in life, and they all did live in rural areas that had connection with nature. They all grew their own gardens and these type of things, and were connected to their family and social ties and everything. So if you look at the longevity studies, these seem to be big elements in longevity. And we've been sold a bill of goods in North America. And I remember when it came out as a kid, it was called Freedom 55. You're going to get in this, you're going to work like heck. You're going to get the golden handshake with a gold watch, a nice retirement pension, and you were going to sit on the beach and drink, Mai Tais.
Mai Tais.
And then
that
be
was
dead.
The drink back then.
But the evidence shows that people who are retiring at this age, they live about 18 months because they don't have any purpose or drive. So the acceleration of the aging, degenerative, and disease development seems to exceed without these other social psychological elements. That led me to research in the Eastern philosophy on the stages and phases of life, which of course have been expressed places like India and China, and have a long history. And if you go into their preemptive medicine, whether it was acupuncture, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic applications, very sophisticated elements of preventative, diagnostic, and post-diagnostic modalities. And I was like, wait a second. Everybody in here in the West, they seem to be diametrically opposed. And it's like, wait a second, we're all trying to get to the same element. We're trying to get to the element of, can we live, stronger? Can we be stronger? Can we live longer? And can we have a better life? Those are the three defining principles that I think everybody shares. And unfortunately, most of the money has, in our current healthcare system as it is been put into as like after the diagnosis care. And, sometimes, one of the things I witness is sometimes the treatment seems worse than the disease. That certainly was the case that I witnessed. I was like, man, and that was a very naive, but it certainly stuck in my craw. And we've been developing this, and that's led to a lot of research in, neurofeedback, psychedelic medicine, some of these nonlinear traditional values that have been applied by indigenous nations around the world for thousands of years, but have been kind of shunted into the corner either through regulation or through, social expulsion. Oh yeah, you can't listen to that guy that's living down in the forest. That's a bunch of crap. Oh, these guys writing about these yogis living in excess of 100 years old and being totally cognitively aware and all these, that's all mystical stuff. We need double-blind studies. And I see both sides of the equation. And so our goal at Bioptimizers is bridge the gap between hardcore double-blind research studies that are properly funded, properly regulated, and are able to develop. But we'd like to move that model into the preventative side, and you're the perfect fusion of that. Let's switch gears a little bit. So I'm curious, obviously you're in a very unique position where you're crossing both worlds. Your professional career is largely in the model I just described, and yet your personal care is obviously at a very high level. Doctors don't have a great life expectancy, but obviously you're thriving, you're vibrant, you have a very pliable mind that's curious about maybe alternative things that maybe many of your colleagues isn't. What are some of the things that you feel is the greatest potential gains as we move into a new paradigm for humanity?
For me, my philosophy in life, Wade, and I think I've lived it in bits and pieces to an extent. And how I ended up really even being in oncology, being in drug development is a story. It's a book in and of itself. But my philosophy has always been flexibility of mind and body. And the moment that you become inflexible and you lose that ability to be able to respond and adapt to an environment, to a stressor, to you lose that resilience, right? That's the day you start really aging, and you go down that road, that leads to death, essentially. I was given a couple of different quotes by patients of mine that lived into that 100+ range. And one of them, which I live by still to this day, which really echoes what you were saying earlier, is I asked her, like, how are you still functioning and healthy and living and vibrant? She's like, never stop working. Either I'm gardening or I'm dancing or I'm playing, backgammon or I'm doing something. Retirement is actually not really a concept that's physiologically, biologically rooted, the way we understand retirement in the West.
Mm-hmm.
Purpose, having that sense of purpose. So I would say the biggest gains really are adopting a posture. There's a famous economist slash philosopher, Nicholas Taleb Nassim, and I may have butchered his name. He wrote this book called The Black Swan, and he has this theory. It's like this anti-fragility theory. Really, like, can you build yourself, your body, your mind as best as possible to remain resilient? And particularly in today's day and age, where it's just, you have so much information, as you mentioned, there's so much to know, so much to absorb, so much to sift through. People are living longer. The competitiveness between human beings, is just insane in terms of, hey, I want a bigger body, I want bigger muscles, I want to lift this much, I want more money. All this stuff can drive someone insane. And so for me, it's like taking that information, how do I respond to that? How do I incorporate it into my own mind and then say, okay, either I accept it and I have to rise to the challenge, or no, I'm very grateful for where I am, the pace that I'm moving, having that sense of gratitude, humility, and knowing I have agency, right, to kind of choose which way. For me, I think that that posture of mind and heart has allowed me to be able to do to run at 150 miles an hour some days, juggle three, four, five different ventures, and still have the emotional capacity, to go home for my friends and family and to show up for them. That's what I would say has been the biggest game changer, just that posture of mind and the flexibility to be able to adapt and navigate.
Yeah, it's a powerful framework to kind of approach life. Is like, am I being in martial arts, a rigid position is a position of weakness. Be the bamboo, not the oak tree.
Yep.
What are some of the things that you've integrated in your life specifically during this discovery process that continues to be ongoing, that you apply on a daily basis to meet the demands of all those areas you just saying, that you said, you know what, based on all of the evidence that I can suggest, here are some things that I incorporate daily to maintain my physical vitality and contribute to what would theoretically be the preventative side of medicine?
Great question. So it's always being refined. I test, I observe, I measure, and then it's an iterative process. But I think the daily practices that I've found very impactful to me, that again are anyone can really adopt, is that I'm grateful. I wake up every morning, Wade, and I'm just so grateful. And whatever you believe in, I thank God for my lungs and the air that I can breathe in, my eyes for the sunshine that comes in, and I take that in, and I do that, for a little bit in the morning. So there's a meditation aspect where I look inward, and then I pray. Prayer to me is this very paradoxical kind of practice where it's like I look inward and I reach out, and for whatever reason, it works in restoring agency, where it's like, okay, I have control over certain things, and then other things I don't need to have control. And there's a sense of relief. I journal. Journaling for me is again just understanding how my brain works, and the flurry of thoughts and the chaos and the storm sometimes that my mind internally has. It serves as a medium, a container of sorts, where I can put something down, a thought, and literally look at it in 3 or 4 different dimensions and revisit it. For me, those have been very impactful. As far as other practices, I do take certain supplements. I'm big on neem. I'm long on neem, just because I've seen, and I wouldn't believe it unless I had seen it with my own eyes over the last 10 years, and how it's been able to really, in cancer patients particularly, that when they've developed cancer and it's an early stage, it's really prevented that cancer from growing for many, many, many months. So certain, again, anti-inflammatory compounds, and there's a whole host of other supplements that I'm constantly kind of tinkering and experimenting with. Gut health is something that I've really started to focus on. I've always had challenges, just being completely transparent. And I'm really happy with the stuff that Bioptimizers has been developing. It's really helped me, I think, better stabilize and digest and really be able to extract the optimal nutrition. So yeah, I think for me, those 3 or 4 things really, that I feel like anybody can do. Just really be observant of your mind, of just being grateful in life for all that you have, and I'll add one more thing, that again is so 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 important. I come from a culture that family is everything. I have a huge family, extended family. I mean, lots of cousins, nephews, and nieces. And I've always been very close to them. And so one of the things I've observed here, particularly post COVID, people have gotten so disconnected from friends and family, and they've become isolated. And for me, at least, that was a period where I actually came closer with some of my family that lives all across the world, and made more of an effort to remain connected. And I felt like for me, at least, COVID, it didn't create that level of anxiety or stress afterwards. And I had COVID at one point. So yeah, that sense of community, gratitude, feeling like, you have agency in certain aspects of your life, and then really optimizing and figuring out nutrition. I could go on and on. One last thing I'll say in terms of nutrition is I've done a panel of genomic testing, whole genome sequencing studies on myself at 100x resolution, really understood my microbiome. And none of these things by in and of itself, I think, was like the game changer. It's really incorporating all these data points and trying to best understand, with your own user experience, let's say, that, hey, okay, if this is what this test is saying, this is what this result is saying, how do I modify my lifestyle in some way that, again, I feel like I'm moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I think this is one of the real interesting aspects. Also, where I think is a combination of subjective feedback, which a person is, and I learned subjective feedback way back in my bodybuilding days when my coach, Scott Abel, who was probably the preeminent bodybuilding coach at the time. And what was unique about his methodology is we had to journal every day. We had to say, was I tired? How was my workout? Did I feel hungry? Was I bloated? What was my state of my brain state or my emotional state? And I remember when I was first doing this isn't all about sets and reps and how strong I got. There was all of these feedback points, and that allowed me. And when you get into high performance bodybuilding, you have to strip away your body fat, and you're suppressing two interesting aspects. That sport is really interesting in the aspect that you have to suppress two things that are counter our genetic inheritance. That is to build an excessive amount of muscle over and above the natural allotted amount by your genetics. And second is to go to suboptimal levels of body fat percentage for the cosmetic appearance, which determines results. Now, in order to do that, you have to become extremely sophisticated if you're going to go to the highest level in overcoming these inherited characteristics, because energy conservation is a primary aspect of survivability. And then low body fat levels is also, increasing body fat, because we were subjected to famine and starvation through most of human history. So someone that could put on body fat easily had a much better chance of survival. And I look to Brett and Heather Weinstein. They have a really interesting podcast on evolutionary biology. I'm actually taking their course through the Peterson Academy. And they were talking about methodologies to look at. And one of the conclusions that they came to, which I think is fascinating in the application of longevity studies, is well, what the primary thesis that he has when looking through an evolutionary lens is that here's what we want to do. We want to be, everything that you see in nature is an evolutionary advantage for one single thing: to put your genes as far into the future as possible. So no matter how obtuse the development and observing a species, an organism, or whatever that is you have to recognize the fact that it's there, and the fact that this species is still on the planet means that there's some advantage that is given, and it's up to you, the scientist, to determine what that advantage is. And they use some very unusual elements that look like counterintuitive, but how they've adapted to their environment and gave them survivability aspects. But there was another conclusion that they came to, which I think was really groundbreaking, and that is the things that can make you push your genes into the future, or give you distinct advantages in mating capability, quality of mates, that sort of stuff, may actually be suboptimal for longevity. In other words, you burn the candle faster to get the advantages of pushing your genetics in time, but you, the individual, may collapse sooner because of that. And of course, we see this in fame and people living excessive lifestyles. They get all this fame, they get all this, it gives them a lot of mating opportunities that are over and above the general public by significant elements that allows them to push those genetics in time. But many of those people die prematurely, and the world loses maybe the skills and advantages and creativity that person may have imparted in the world. So this is it's a very interesting element. Now,
it's this increase in entropy It's this increase in
Yes.
entropy almost as the faster you kind of go. And there's a wonderful paper, very mathematical in terms of how they correlate the aging process really as kind of this physics equation, and the laws of entropy and how it applies. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Well,
fascinating.
his brother Eric, who is one of the preeminent theoretical physicists on the planet and an extraordinary mathematician, him and his brother, of course, had a lot of back and forth. His brother being an evolutionary biologist, him being a physics guy. So they have interesting discussions that they've extracted over the course of their lifetime, which they apply. And some of them are non-intuitive. You really need to be thinking at a high level. But then when you put these models down, it goes, oh, wow, how well. So going back to a thing that you touched on, because it's actually an area that we've experimented in Bioptimizers with our research, and that is the application of AI models to see what particular molecules may work in combination. And now with AI, you can run all these simulations prematurely without all of the grunt work. What do you see happening with AI as its ability to advance gains in either premature aging or higher quality of life? What are you seeing in your side of the research?
Yeah, it's an incredible time. I've only seen it go from the amount of knowledge, the amount of advancement in terms of compressing the time that it takes to really understand the known chemical space, interactions in the chemical space, how proteins fold, in secondary, tertiary, quaternary folds, and how they interact with one another. I mean, these processes of again in drug development, you've got a protein or a target of some kind, then you're trying to find a molecule within a defined space, and typically it's chemical libraries, that are available for purchase. So you have 30,000 chemicals on one series of plates, or you may have 100,000. And the traditional process has been like you're going to screen all of that on by hand or with a series of students or chemists. And at some point we developed robotics to be able to do multiplex kind of screening, but still, it was a physical labor of love, let's call it, that would take weeks to months to years to do. That whole process, Wade, what I've seen, because now you can take these chemicals and we've digitized them, and AlphaFold is a prime example, really, of the level of technology. In fact, the guy who recently won the Nobel Prize, one of the three guys who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry a few weeks ago, is the developer of AlphaFold. But really, what that program
Can you explain
does,
what AlphaFold is? Yeah, can you explain what that
yeah,
program is?
Google had, so there's a company called DeepMind. Google
Yep.
acquired DeepMind several years ago. DeepMind was developing algorithms to be able to basically gaming level algorithms, like your chess, Go, so forth. But they figured that the technology could be applied to resolve protein structures and how these protein structures interact under different conditions, and be able to understand, okay, well, if this is the protein structure, here's a bunch of chemicals that have now been defined in the space through X-ray crystallography. Can we now start figuring out what chemicals match the proteins? This is one application. So it's an advanced algorithm or series of algorithms, I'd say, that allow for researchers, companies, whoever, to be able to understand in silico what proteins look like, how they fold, how they interact, and then be able to conduct any series of experiments with other proteins, other chemicals. So that's the program AlphaFold.
That's so
So yeah,
it's
it's
so interesting, right?
wild. So you can imagine now that if you could screen essentially what would take you weeks to months, you can screen in a matter of days. That's one application. So we're able to compress the time by which we can figure out, hey, if you've got a new protein that you think hits on a particular part of the aging process and we don't have a drug for it, well, you can screen any number of chemicals that exist, and you can then use a scaffold to develop maybe a medication, a therapeutic, or even screen, let's say, known plant compounds or naturally derived substances that are available and repurpose them, right? That's one application. But I think the most incredible, promising, and I'm cautiously optimistic about the second kind of iteration of this is that we now have the ability to make entirely new protein sequences, entirely new molecules that have never existed on the face of the planet. they're not found, naturally speaking. But we have the ability to now not only predict exactly how they would interact with a particular protein in our body that has been considered undruggable or unreachable or untargetable, but now we can actually do that all in a computer, figure out exactly what the profile would be if you hit this protein, what else does it affect downstream, understand all of that signaling pathway. And ever before you even go and develop that molecule in a lab, you've got a pretty good idea of, hey, how is this going to really look like in a human body? That's the power of AI.
It's funny you should mention that because I had the good fortune of meeting Dr. Gerald Pollack a number of years ago, who wrote an interesting book called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. And he's a kind of a radical renegade scientist that said, well, in order to do real science, I had to get out of the labs and create my own center, because I was proving the people who had to validate my information, I was proving them wrong, and they didn't want to validate my stuff. So I had to create my own lab. And he says, the rule of the lab is break the rules.
Love it.
Now, his claim to fame is developing a technology called easy water. I don't know if you've heard of it. So he was able to prove that water actually exists in 4 states: solid, liquid, gas, and a crystalline state. So, for example, when we see that little rising element of the water at the edge of your glass, well, there's a little micro layer inside of that, or nano layer or whatever, that this water had different properties. And that property was correlated with proper protein folding in the body and led to different results. So, for example, a technology that was built out of it that's widespread in the biohacking community is a NanoV, which is a water where in order to get this, you run a certain element of light through that. Light is a contributing factor, and that creates more of this easy water layer. And the idea behind it is that you ingest this allows you to manage your protein folding. Now, all that aside, can you elucidate for our listeners, what is protein folding, and why is that important in the body? Because I think people talk about protein folding. Is that like, folding up my hamburger, or is it, like what does that mean from an applicable, thought concept for the average person who may not be versed in all of that science?
And now for a Bioptimizers fixed digestion tip: supercharge your protein shake. Everyone knows protein shakes are a great way to sneak in extra protein, build more muscle, even replace meals and burn more fat. The problem is the highest quality protein typically absorbs at around 40%. One way to fix this and dramatically increase how quickly and effective your protein shake digests is to add 2 to 3 capsules of masszymes into your shake. One research study showed that pre-digested protein during a meal increased muscle growth significantly. To take advantage of this, just blend the open capsules into your shake, and within 15 minutes or less, the enzymes will have begun to break down the protein into amino acids. This can make your shakes at least 2 to 3 times more potent. Some people do this and sip on their shake while lifting to provide their muscles with a steady stream of amino acids during their workout. To save 10% on masszymes, use the code SHAKE10, that's SHAKE10, at masszymes.com. That's SHAKE10 at masszymes.com.
So I'll touch back and bring it back to evolutionary biology. You mentioned that you're studying that. If we have 20,000 to date discovered genes that code for protein. Okay, just the code for protein. And there's many, many other genes that code for non-protein substances like RNA and the various species of RNA. And proteins, essentially, the classical theory, when I was training in med school in the lab and so forth, was that, hey, you have one protein, it does one thing. The reality really is that you can have one protein that has multiple different functions, and all it depends on is how it's been folded, whether it's straight, whether it's got a kink here, whether it's got a kink this way, and where it's located. So depending on what part of the cell it's in, it can perform one function. Depending on another part, a kink forms and it forms another function. So it's the way that I think we have been designed to utilize and maximize the efficiency of these biological structures, amino acids that turn into proteins, and it's much more complex than that in terms of even how the DNA gets transcribed to RNA, and that RNA gets spliced. Spliced RNA sometimes leads to these proteins that can maybe kink this way, kink a little bit this way, or kink that way. So it's the same protein, but a different isoform of it, let's call it, right? So the thought process is that because, again, of these variations in the way these proteins fold, they perform different functions, and therefore these proteins act as adapters for other proteins. You have sometimes a collection of proteins that form supramolecular complexes. These machines, think of it as transformers in a way, or Legos. You put a few pieces here, they form one thing, they can perform different functions, or they act as scaffolds for other proteins, bridges, let's say. It's remarkable in how these proteins function just by the way that they fold and by the way that they kink. The other important component I'll say of protein folding is relevant to drug development. And again, because in cancer, some of these proteins may fold a slightly different way because of a mutation, because of one amino acid change. Now you have a protein that typically has a few areas where it's hinged and you can attach a drug. But in some cases, like the famous one is KRAS, it's a oncogenic protein found in a lot of colorectal cancers, lung cancers. For the longest time, Wade, this was a drug developer's nightmare, because this protein essentially now, because of that one mutation, was like a bowling ball almost. It was just smooth for all intents and purposes. You couldn't find another molecule, another protein or drug to latch onto it and inhibit its function. We've now figured out how to get around that, in clever ways. But essentially, that's what protein folding is used for normally. And then in pathology states or in states of disease, what that protein folding can look like. The third thing I'll bring up is protein folding can lead to different kinds of peptides, so chopped up protein sequences that then get presented on a cell and recognized by the immune system. And if it's folded one way, it leads to a much more immunogenic reaction, meaning that your immune cell recognizes it. It creates a memory that, hey, this is not a normal looking protein. We need to kind of keep an eye out on it. Or if it, folds another way, well, then it doesn't recognize it. So there's strategies that we can employ now and leverage the mechanism of protein folding to our advantage.
To give a reference, since you use transformers for our listeners, essentially it sounds like, protein folding is very much like the key man in the Matrix movies, where, to get anywhere in the Matrix, he had to build a key. He would make a key, and that could open up the doors to the back ends of the Matrix. And of course, he had a bunch of defense mechanisms that allowed you to keep away from. He had Seraph and the kind of control. And I always love I do think that art imitates life, which translates to science. And there's a fusion between art and science that I think is oftentimes overlooked, because if you get into this stuff, there's the science, but like the intuitive interpretations in order to make those breakthroughs or to make observations that maybe no one else, is essentially art. And I always say that art is like if you look at athletic performance, why does everybody celebrate instantaneously when someone scores a remarkable goal? And there is a neurochemical effect in the recognition that what has just happened on the playing field is unique and worth celebrating. So intuitively, as a human species, we celebrate art, and art is essentially a science applied to an area in a unique way. How do you feel that AI interactions, protein folding, changing the paradigm of what's possible for longevity and a healthy life, how do you see that unfolding in, no pun intended, over the next, say, few decades? And how do you see yourself inserting in that conversation? Because it's obviously a passion of yours, or you wouldn't probably be here.
Yeah, it certainly is. And I on certain days, I'm so hopeful, optimistic, and curious, in terms of how these technologies are going to help shape our evolution as a species. We're almost, we're kind of cyborgs at this point. Our iPhone's kind of glued here, and these glasses that project AR and augmented forms of reality. And but on the other hand, I have deep concerns from an ethical standpoint, from the standpoint that some of these new proteins, let's say, going back into the world of protein folding and the accelerated development of new molecules that just have never existed on this planet. We don't necessarily know the long-term implications of such things. And I'll give you an example more from the genetics perspective, is gene editing, right? With CRISPR. CRISPR-Cas9 technology has really changed the face of how we have started to develop medicines in cancer. And we are developing these chimeric antigen receptor cells, CAR T cells, for example, that are in the clinic, FDA approved, have been approved for various cancers for the last 4 or 5 years. But guess what? Now we're finding that with at least a couple of these particular CAR constructs, which is a genetically modified T cell, we've inserted something that we've edited in a lab and then put it into a T cell, grown those T cells out by the billions, and infused them back into the patient. Some of these patients have these T cells that were chimeric. I would call them, unnatural kinds of cells, that don't exist in the body. These are actually turning out to be the cancer now. They have actually become the cancer, cancers of the T cells specifically. So the point I'm trying to raise is that where I see my role and where I would love to continue to work further is that while we are marching ever so with this pace that is not linear, it's exponential almost, right, as to what we're able to achieve. And these new molecules, these new proteins, new antibodies that are being constructed, all through the use of AI and the field of synthetic biology, which is essentially that we can create synthetic DNA to create entirely new species of organisms, so to say, or at a bacterial level for now. And what I recently learned is we're able to create an artificial erythrocyte, a red blood cell, completely out of synthetic DNA, not taken from a human being, all from a lab. We don't fully understand the implications of some of these things, and I think an approach needs to be taken that, yes, while I'm all for citizen science, I'm all for biohacking, these kinds of conversations should be had in parallel with people that also understand, hey, what's the safety profile? And if you have a particular reaction, the last thing you should do is just be afraid to be like, I did something illegal, or I did something I shouldn't have. I don't know who to talk to. No, we need to have appropriate personnel, trained, knowledgeable, empathetic, not judgmental, to say, hey, listen, if you've done this, here's maybe a protocol that we can employ, because we've been trying to understand, hey, what are the side effects or the risk profiles for some of these things happening? So on one end, I'm extremely optimistic that, yeah, we are going to see increases in lifespan and health span, better recovery times, from any kind of stress that we put under our bodies. This amazing new paradigm in terms of the evolution of how a human being used to only live till 30, 40, 50, now we're living to 100, and not just living, but functional, able to procreate even to some extent, into those later ages. I see that. But what I would say also is that let's figure out a framework. Let's keep the communication channels open, right, between these different worlds that I swim particularly, which is the very hardcore evidence-based, randomized, controlled medical world, and then the much more fluid, much more experimental world of the biohackers, the plant medicine guys, the guys tinkering with tech, and the fusion between biological material and really in silico. That those channels need to always remain open, man. And that's the one thing I would say that I want to continuously, promote.
Yeah, there's a wide-ranging aspects. I know that Brett has talked about it. Elon Musk has discussed it about what are the law of unintended consequences we race, towards a new future. And of course, what's fascinating with the development of the silicon brain, essentially. So if we're essentially a cybernetic organism, which most of us are, because of the implant of, all this frequency devices, technology, and all that sort of stuff. And of course, we have the singularity folks that says that we're going to fuse together. I had a lovely lady, Nenea Reeves, who's on the cutting edge of developing 3D technology that really takes you out of the background radiation or the background information of what's going on in my body. Like, I'm noticing these things and I go into this 3D headset and it becomes so real. I lose perceptual awareness of myself. And I went through that and I asked her, I said, do you believe the singularity is going to happen? She says, yes. And I said, well, when will we know? And she goes like, we won't. And the question is, if we go into this fusion of humans and machines en masse, my question is, and my business partner and I are both, we're at opposing, like we are oftentimes, we're at opposing ideas. He's like, I'm in, hook me up to the matrix. It's just gonna like reduce the amount of friction of input. I'm all for it. And I'm like, right. But how will you distinguish between that which is you and that which is, a machine algorithm? And I think that becomes very difficult, which leads us now, essentially, in order to manage this world, we're talking a consciousness revolution. And all the consciousness researchers that have been focusing, noetic sciences and all this stuff, they're looking at consciousness as something that is inserted into the protoplasm. Myself, with my own personal experiences in my study of Eastern philosophy and the application of some of the arts in that, I don't see it that way. I see consciousness as almost like a cloud from which we access, and we have the illusion that these are my thoughts, my ideas, my concepts, because we're caught in this three-dimensional input system related to our protoplasm. In other words, my sensory experiences is determining, essentially, has become so dominant, it makes me think as an individualized aspect. Yet, I notice socially, we are connected deeply with other people, and that we identify with other people, whether it's country, whether it's a sports team, whether it's our family members. There's all these substratas of humanity which have existed imperceptibly because they're so ingrained into the sense of identification. And when I began applying this, I read Autobiography of a Yogi years ago. I actually just finished it again, I think for the 15th time last night. And I was always fascinated with these individuals that had these super physiological and almost superhuman-like capabilities, who are living up in the mountains or had practiced these unique techniques that seem obscure. And yet many of it wasn't validated in, say, hardcore research science. They were just kind of poo-pooed as, mystics, or that's crazy, new age, all that stuff, which leads us to this complication. And we're seeing more and more people now submitting themselves to psychedelic experiences. In other words, they're experimenting with traditional plant medicines, compounds that were used in ceremony and therapies and both physical and psychological in traditional realms. But they're applying it today to meet the demands of, essentially, we've booted up with all of this technological innovation, biochemical integration with unknown consequences. We've essentially booted up a new evolutionary pressure on humanity that we haven't been subjected to before, which means that we need to have a much more novel way of identifying this, because the consequences, it's one thing if I'm a bodybuilder, and this is common, I see these professional bodybuilders, these are the hardcore of the heart. And over these evolutionary limitations, they're taking massive amounts of hormonal compounds. They're taking, pain regulating machines. Some of them are using genetic CRISPR genes to change their genetics. They're on the bleeding edge, and their life expectancy of bodybuilders very low. Especially in the professional ranks, they're essentially going, you know what? I'm going to be a dragster. I'm going to go as fast as I can and blow up at the end of the track. I don't care, because my goals. That's really cool, and I'm all for individual responsibility. But now when we get into some of this tech, AI being one of it, or the production of chemicals that may be distributed through the air, like if we look at the COVID pandemic, which now pretty much confirms yeah, these were some novel technologies that some people with some questionable ethics were experimenting on, probably got out into the world, and we don't know what the long-term consequences of this is going to be. So now it's one thing to do self-experimentation. It's a whole other to do self-experimentation that may threaten all of humanity or even a small segment of humanity without their, blessings. How do you see psychedelics or psychedelic research or some of these elements that allow us to kind of expand from our singular identification, which can be very, very, it's kind of like a hangover, like I talk about, like the individualized, like we live in the me culture with, these phones. Everything's about me. Everything's curated for me. Everything is, I'm living in this kind of echo chamber that creates a political ideology, a social ideology, an economic ideology, my own heroes and demons and everything. And we're literally seeing neighbors or people in the same place living in completely different information networks and making decisions or judgments socially or personally that seem so real to them, but yet it's so obtuse to literally their next door neighbor. Being in California, I see this all the time. And yet we see this craving for unification, more and more people going into these traditional experiences that transform individual consciousness into collective consciousness. What's your experience or thoughts around that? That was a big statement, but I think it's one that I think is going to be the question of our generations now and into the future.
Yeah. I think about this frequently as to just being having my own clinic where we are able to offer certain psychedelic treatments and again some under research, and then having experience with psychedelics. There's several ways to kind of approach this, and the first thing I'll say is that there is this resurgence and this renewed interest in these very, very old medicines or derivatives thereof that we've been able to figure out. Hey, this like LSD, for example, it's an ergot derivative. It's derived from a fungus, similar in structure to with the tryptamine kind of core as magic mushrooms. I think that resurgence, as if you look at history, human history, and you track periods of incredible kind of explosions in tech or in cultural revolutions or some kind of phase shift in humanity, psychedelics have subtly played a role in these stages of development. And I think that this particular period of time where, again, we've got power in a technological way, I equate AI almost akin to nanotech and the nuclear bomb. It is that powerful. And when these things are happening in front of our eyes, there is again this like overwhelming feeling sometimes that people have. It's like, wait, what does it even mean to be human anymore? We got hit with COVID. We have AI coming online that's created in some fashion, again, that same level of like disconnection, so to say, between other human beings that are like us, that think like us, that talk like us, or even the ones that don't, right? I mean, just our neighbors sometimes. This polarization has occurred. So I feel like psychedelics are being explored again, not just by the general public, but really, I mean, large academic centers, these bastions of higher learning, and people really trying to understand, like, okay, well, what does it really mean to be human anymore when I can access the entire world's knowledge at my fingertips with ChatGPT or something thereof? Or now we have brain chips, being implanted into our minds or our heads. Like, what capabilities are going to emerge from that? So I think in that respect, they help connect us back to our core self, and I believe help us realize that we are not just a physical mass of protoplasm. There is a spirit, there is this consciousness that resides outside of a physical body, and help us tap into that metaphysical, right? So that's one way that I kind of view this whole the use and the cultural kind of paradigm shift around the acceptance of psychedelics, and certainly now at a political level with the new administration coming in. The second way I view psychedelics, again, through personal experience and that understanding the science really of what they're able to accomplish in the brain, we don't fully understand exactly whether it's neuroplasticity or metaplasticity, right? I mean, is there basal underlying function? Dr. Gould Dolan's work focuses more on this theory of that it opens up critical periods in the brain. Critical periods are opened up in childhood, really, where where you have to learn a new language, you got to learn a new motor skill, whatever it is, and you're able to learn it like that, right? I mean, as a kid, you're like a sponge. That doesn't normally occur as you age in adult life. The prevailing theory in neuroscience has been that you don't form new neurons as you age. We're learning that that's not really true. And so, what psychedelics are able to do, and this is again very emerging, it's cutting edge still, we're not fully sure, is that there are most classical psychedelics, including ones that are not really true psychedelics like ketamine, they promote something called dendritogenesis. They promote something called neuroplasticity, which all it means is it allows the brain to rewire and adapt to new situations and intake new materials. So just relearning of things, right? But now, again, with certain compounds that I know you and I talked about offline, we're learning just the power of like 5-MeO-DMT or bufo. You can actually form new neurons in part of the hippocampus, which is related to memory. And there's a few other areas that, again, you see this ability to rewire the brain and learn new things. Why is that important? I love this kind of quote, and I'm going to try my best not to butcher it, by Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote this book, Sapiens, and then followed it up with another book, really as to, well, what happens when man...
Yeah, he did Sapiens,
Yeah.
21 Lessons for the 21st Century,
Yep.
and Homo Deus. I read
And
the
Homo
whole
Deus.
series.
Yeah, and I mean, he says this thing, like, in the 21st century, the greatest skill that we're going to have is the ability to learn something, and then not too long after that, the ability to completely forget that and relearn something instead of that, because the world, we live in, I mean, it's pacing and changing so quickly that the skills that we learn today, they're going to be antiquated probably in 5 to 10 years. We just have to keep learning and have the ability to do that. Wade, that requires a degree of mental flexibility, cognitive horsepower, let's say. I know stuff that you're all really interested in. You've got your own techniques figured out. I think, again, psychedelics, in their own way, are able to help put the brain into that mode. And again, that mode, I would say, is very, you have to be very careful, because you're like a sponge. You can learn new things. Now, you have to be careful as to, are you learning something that's beneficial for you, or are you taking on new habits or new thoughts and new paradigms and constructs that are not beneficial? It's a non-specific amplifier of whatever it is that you put in. So
Yeah,
that's my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, it's funny because when I read his book, it reminded me of a book I read much, much earlier by Alvin Toffler called Future Shock. And he said that technology would increase at such a rapid rate. The skills of the future is not to learn skills, to learn, unlearn, and relearn. So he kind of borrowed on that as a futurist, and Alvin was way ahead of his time in regards to that. And then you have also, when you're talking about psychedelic implications, and we've seen this over and over. One of my friends, they're part of exposing the NVIDIA cult, and you hear these. I'm actually close friends. They were actually inside of that organization, and
I'm not familiar with this cult.
Yeah. That's a whole trip. Yeah, that's a whole trip. But one of the elements that happens oftentimes in sort of cult dynamics is the use of these medicines, and some of those, like I call the drug dealer of the present day is now a shaman. But if you look at the shamanistic practices that have been practiced by indigenous nations for thousands of years, it's much more inclusive and long term. Very much like if you were going to become a surgeon or whatever, and they go through a rigorous training. Same things when you look at the mystics who have lived in monasterial environments that develop, superhuman capabilities. They're in very controlled environments, often away from the public for extensive period of times, and not married to the responsibilities of the world. Now we have CEOs, medical doctors, professionals, but to have a high level of professional skill set, they decide, my life's not working, my wife's unhappy, I'm not so sure about where I'm going. I'm going to go off and, go crazy on the psychedelic realm. and they have these transformative personal experiences that often have significant consequences to their regular life. All of a sudden, they've literally, took a rocket ride in their consciousness, and coming back to their old life, it's not nearly as fulfilling or connected. And they oftentimes gravitate into these organizations that advocate this stuff without fully vetting what is the potential consequences to your current sustainability in the modern world as is. So we have also the clash of these two cultural items. So it's a very exciting time. It's also, a very precarious time for humanity, as we now have the potency power. Weinstein said this best. He says, he's a believer in physics, and that's his discipline. But he said, the physics of the world unfortunately unlocked the ability of humanity to annihilate itself. So he says, I believe it's our responsibility to figure out how we suspend that capability, because there's too much power for the caveman brain, who is just all about self and tribe and that sort of, like, we can't have tribalism in this type of environment. What do you see unfolding? Only got a few minutes left. What do you see? Because I got another call. We'll have to do a part two. What do you see unfolding in your own work in regards to these things and the potential responsible use of these compounds in an environment that would actually enhance life while minimizing the potential downside, both socially and professionally, to society?
It's such an important question, Wade, and I really appreciate that you highlighted this issue of what I call them Instagram shamans. Like where you've got a guy that was bussing tables one day, or was a high powered CEO, and a few months ago now had this transformative experience and is like an evangelist now for feeding other people and creating this cult like this mindset. I feel that, and this has been a driving force for me to kind of enter the field of psychedelics very cautiously, almost as a student, in that there is so much of work to still be done, taking these very ancient old compounds that were used ritualistically with reverence in ceremony, in the sense of community and communal healing a lot of times, right? Like ayahuasca, for example. And trying to figure out, and again, these are given to people who are not on SSRIs, not on, 15 other kinds of medications, and translating that ancient wisdom and knowledge very carefully into the modern day and age, and having systems in place to say, okay, at least this is what we do in our clinic, is to say, hey, listen, if you are on these meds, if this is your social history, your family history, these are your goals, your intentions, well, maybe, 2 infusions of ketamine would be good for you. Maybe they will not. Maybe you have treatment-resistant depression and there's a protocol for that. Maybe it's none of the above, and all you need is some neurofeedback, something completely non-pharmacological, right? So I think where I kind of stand is that, number one, we need more education around the subject, not, again, put behind closed doors in the shadows. There needs to be crosstalk between people from the underground kind of communities that have been practicing these things with physicians and scientists such as myself, who only have one particular vantage point, right? So invite people into these discussions, be able to share knowledge, but bilaterally. So education, more research. Certainly, I think that even though the double-blind placebo-controlled trials for these series of compounds is not maybe optimal, I do think that there's other ways to study them, and in healthy individuals as well. So more research. And I think, again, the responsible ethical use of these compounds, where you are putting someone into a highly suggestible state for, if not minutes to hours, but for weeks on end. Where is the framework around that, really, to say, hey, is the person you're going to experience ayahuasca with, or have this kind of trip or journey with, what are their intentions? Just again, from my own background, my brain as a scientist, looking at pros, cons, and everything in the middle, that's where I kind of come in, and I'm trying to develop a framework for all of it.
Well, we'll resume this conversation in a part two because we're just getting into the fun stuff. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us, Dr. Aneel. Can you share with people maybe some of your work where people can access it and all the cool things that you're doing in case they want to follow up with some of your references or some of the work that you're doing?
Sure. So a lot of my oncology work is up on PubMed. You can just put my name in there. And a lot of that's been focused on novel drug development in cancer, particularly immunotherapies. How do you engage the immune system? And then, of course, for anything related to your mental health and where you're looking for any kind of alternative strategies to the SSRIs and the benzos of the world, that's where West Eastern Health really has a place that I think we're in a position to be able to help you out and or at least guide you in the right direction. Because that's our goal, just for you to live healthier and happier and a little bit longer if we can.
Thank you very much for joining us today. For all our listeners, we're going to put all of the show links inside here where you can see East West and the website and the work that Dr. Aneel is doing in the world. It's nice to know that there are these hardcore researchers in the science field that have embraced some of the nonlinear or traditional values and are at the forefront of fusing these two great technologies to build a better humanity. Thank you for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. And for all our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, like it, share it, give us your comments. We'd love to hear about it. I'm Wei-T Lightheart from Bioptimizers. This is the Awesome Health Show. We'll see you on the next episode.
And now for a Bioptimizers fixed digestion tip: how to get away with eating sugar. Hey, look, sugar is normally one of the worst things for you. But let's be honest. I mean, we all cheat from time to time. And here's a little trick that will ensure your body benefits from the sugar. Now, before you eat or drink anything sweet, take 5 to 8 capsules of P3OM. The patented strain in the formula devours sugar so fast it literally doubles in the body every 20 minutes in the presence of sugar. That doesn't mean that you can or you should eat a bunch of sugar or sit around all day doing that. But on the days that you do cheat or you go after one of those maybe meals that you wouldn't normally do, this ensures that you get something in your gut that eats the sugar. And it's not going to feed the bad guys or spike your blood glucose nearly as much. So to learn more about P3OM and its sugar-devouring and protein-digesting properties and how it can transform your gut and metabolism, go to www.bioptimizers.com.
Thank you for listening to the Bioptimizers Awesome Health Podcast. You can find more information at bioptimizers.com.